All right, we're live.
I'm looking and I don't see it. There we are. There we are.
That's going to be a problem.
Oh.
That's going to be a problem. You're watching us.
Mm-hmm.
Give people a few minutes to.
Yeah, that's the only downside of waiting until, because we still have to give people time to get on. Looks like some people are coming on.
You.
That's it?
Yeah.
Some people might also be on YouTube unless we can see both here.
We should be able to see both. That's why, again, I think the video format of pre-recorded everything is going to be a lot better. We'll go to the 3-minute mark and then we'll just start.
Okay. No. Where did she come from?
The open door.
I didn't see Arthur gonna come in. What?
Oh, the numbers or lack thereof for this. 2 kids with 2 tin cans and a line of string would get better ratings than we do.
So in public air, you've already just voiced that concern instead of being hopeful in yourself.
I'm just self-deprecation. All right, let's go. All right, so tonight we've got Diana on for what was supposed to be the second installment of our Women's History series, but due to events beyond everyone's control last week, this is going to be the first installment. So tonight, some of you might have remembered, we had Diana on back in November.
Something like that.
To talk about the ATS and uniforms of the ATS, the women in the service of the British Army. So tonight, we're going to talk about the Navy and the Air Force. So I guess the best way to do this, and the way I thought about doing this, is we'll go in reverse order of seniority. So that means we'll hit the WWII first, and then we'll do the Navy.
Okay.
The Navy being the senior service and everything. So tell me a little bit about the WWII. What was?
Okay.
What? Yeah, hold on. It's a multiple part question. How did they come into being? Why are they formed? Give us a brief synopsis of their history.
It's pretty much the same as the ATS. So they started off in World War I as a totally different corps with the Women's Royal Air Force. And they were attached to the early flying Air Force that was created with the biplanes and the planes of World War I. That lasted from 1918 until 1920. And there's lots of dates, so I have my cards so I don't get anything mixed up. In 1920, with the end of World War I, like the Queen Mary's Auxiliary Army Corps, they were disbanded. Then World War II was looming. So the ATS were formed in 1938. And at that time, 8 companies were attached to the Royal Air Force. Now, unlike in America, the British had an actual Air Force. we had an Army Air Corps. And so when the American WWII were serving, they were still Army and they served with the Army Air Corps. In this case, 8 Army companies were serving what was called the Royal Air Force. So in 1939, the Air Force was like, nope, we want jurisdiction over all of our people. And so those 8 groups of ATS were transitioned into what would become known as the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, and the official Women's Air Force Corps was created for World War II. So this was 1939, and the WWII existed from 39 until 1949. Again, their purpose, to free men to fly. So they would take over a lot of the positions so that more men can get behind the planes and the other more technical ideals of the Air Force. In 1949, in 1941, just like in the ATS, they went from being volunteers to full Air Force. So they got full military rank. Like in 1939 to 1941, they still had the same volunteer rank as the ATS. In 1941, they switched over to Air Force rank, and basically you could not just come and go as you please because you were now considered enlisted. There was a conscription, so the conscription didn't just last for, hey, you could be conscripted into the Air Force or the Army or the Navy. Women between the ages of 20 and 30 could either be drafted and say, you have a choice. You're going to do work, so you have the choice of joining one of our auxiliary corps, or you could go into the factories. So women who were drafted had those 2 choices. In 1949, they actually switched over to 100%. Instead of being an auxiliary corps, they were now the Women's Royal Air Force. They went back to their title from World War I. This lasted until 1994, and then the women's part disappeared, and they were fully integrated as Royal Air Force.
So you mentioned that.
Hold on. At the peak of their enlistment in 1943, there was over 181,000 women serving in the WWII.
It's not a small, it's not a small insignificant number.
Smaller than the ATS, but greater than the Navy.
So they're kind of the midpoint between the two.
Yeah.
So, like you mentioned, that you've got the WWII is there to free up men for action and combat-related billets and duties. What sort of jobs the RAF using them for? And are there any that really particularly stand out? Like when you talk about the ATS, if you mention ATS, 2 things come to mind: ACAT girls and drivers.
Yeah.
What is kind of the signature or the most glamorous position for the RAF?
Well, first of all, just getting into the RAF was glamorous. Their numbers were smaller than the ATS because they didn't have as many positions to fill. And even though the women were not a fan of their uniforms, the blue still looked better than the Army brown.
Okay.
So a lot of women would say, I want to get into the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, but they couldn't and were just slid over into the Army. If you made it in, there was always the usual 5 C's: cooking, clerical, or the 3 C's: cooking, clerical, and cleaning. And this is where I also need this to make sure I don't say it wrong. They would also take over as aircraft mechanics. They were even though some women would join the Princess Mary's Royal Air Force Nursing Service, there were women who actually served as I don't want to say aircraft. See, this is the one I forgot to write down.
They were flight orderlies.
Yes, they were flight
on
orderlies.
medical flights.
So they would go on the medical flights and assist the nurses in that. They also did photographic interpretation. So anybody who's ever seen Foyle's War, in the one where Sam loses her position in the MTC, she gets that job in the estate in the country. And there's a ton of RAF there with their photographs, and WAP are working there in photographic interpretation. They did radar. They did barrage balloons. They did packing of the parachutes. And of course, all 3 services, you mostly hear of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force and the Women's Royal Naval Service working in Bletchley Park, but there was still ATS there. And in Bletchley Park, they were also doing that thing with the codes and solving the enigmas. But the one that is mentioned most is what is called the Y service. And the Y service, from anything I could find, seems to be strictly ARIA that I have found to this point. And the Y service was the interception of any radio and telephone messages. And the RAF was big into this because their radar, like even though all women's auxiliaries would work radar and things like this, because they were the ones following the planes, the women of the Royal Air Force had the stronger radar, they had the stronger signals pulling in all of these coded messages. And then of course, the last one you'll see most women do that they can do it was the plotting. But the interpretation of these codes seems to fall squarely on the WAF for the most part.
Well, yeah, because WISER, it's all signals intelligence work. Bletchley Park is decoding the WISE service is what's picking up the broadcasts. And then, of course, you've got the, I think for me, when I think WAF, I think 1940 Battle of Britain, fighter command,
Yeah.
plotting and vectoring squadrons out for intercept.
Yeah.
For me, that's the penultimate WAF look.
Yeah.
So, all right. So you mentioned that the uniforms were a little bit more stylish. Let's talk uniforms. Give us what. All right. When a girl hits basic training, what is the basic uniform she's issued? What is the standard service dress uniform?
It's the one right behind us. It's not 100%, but I like to say it's the ATS uniform in blue.
Okay.
That's the only thing that makes it more stylish. It's got the RAF buttons. And then you have your service dress with the same 4 panels, 4-bore skirt. You have the same belt. The big thing that I have never seen with the WAF, as I did with the ATS, is you don't have your 38 style, your 41 style, your austerity style. For the most part, you keep the pleated pockets, you have a pocket in the bottom skirt, and it always had a full belt, whereas the ATS had the half belt. So in 1938, when the ATS just seemed to have this big sack-like coat, in 1941, they tailored it to look more like the WAF uniform behind me, but the WAF, for the most part, maintained this uniform. Their hats, again, are very much like the ATS. They do have the stiff leather bill instead of the fabric bill that you would see, or even the cloth-covered bill of the ATS. And they have the Royal Air Force cap badge. Pale blue shirt, black tie. Again, enlisted women were modeled after officers because no lady would ever be unladylike. Hence, officer style.
Stockings and shoes.
Grayish blue Lyle stockings and black Oxfords.
Okay. So, kind of my follow-up to that is, you described some positions or some jobs that they're doing that are fairly labor-intensive. You've got women riding along as orderlies on medical evacuation flights. You've got women working on aircraft. You've got women working on barrage balloons. What sort of working wear is developed for them and issued to the WAF?
For the most part, they would have a battle dress. Again, it mimics the ATS battle dress, but it's an RAF wool. And that would be for the women who are like your medical orderlies, your barrage balloons, anyone working on radar where they might get dirty and skirts aren't practical. Aircraft mechanics had a one-piece coverall. And of course, everybody else, all services had their wraparound coverall or their frock coverall, which is just like a nice cotton in your service colors. So for the RAF, it's blue. And that would be what they would do to clean their barracks and stuff like that.
Did they ever issue out boots? And like the ATS had
all services had Wellingtons.
No, I'm talking about the ankle boots. Like the ATS had their like 2 or 3 pattern ankle boot. Did the WAF have the similar?
Yes, but it was a one pattern. It was smaller, and oftentimes you wouldn't find metal underneath it because if you had to climb on the wings of an airplane, you don't want the metal eating into the airplane.
Right, or creating sparks when you're pumping aviation fuel. All right, so where are they? Did they deploy any of them? So when I think of the British military in World War II, you're talking about an army that's fighting the 4 corners of the world almost. Mm-hmm. Did they? I know they sent the ATS overseas. Did they send the WAF? And
yes.
If they did, I mean, so they sent them outside?
Yes.
In the UK? Okay. Whereabouts?
Everywhere in the I guess, the Eastern Theater. I have not found too many accounts of them going into the Pacific, but for the most part, their big areas were Cairo, like Egypt, and then after D-Day, they went into main Europe.
You haven't found accounts of them going to India?
Possibly they just mostly focus on Egypt.
Okay.
I mean, my research on this is kind of like, there's a lot out there, I'm sure, but what I have personally found, the big focuses were Egypt and mainland Europe or the UK.
Okay. When they're overseas, is there an RAF or WAF version of the tropical uniform?
Yes.
And what would that look like?
It would again be the same as the ATS. You would have the cotton skirt, but instead of a Airtex bush jacket, it was made of cotton.
So they went with the drill route, not
Yeah.
the Airtex.
And then they would have the same, they would do khaki little for those, but they would still have the black Oxfords, the blue hat. They could wear the side cap, reminiscent of the men's. Or if everybody was able to get a supply of sandals, the entire company can wear the same sandal.
I was going to say, I thought sandals were big over.
The official dress is Oxfords. The unofficial dress was sandals if the entire company can get the same sandal. And then they can wear them with also ankle socks.
Okay. So I'm going to get back in the Wayback Machine when we started doing this, because that's going to be my wrap up question for the WAF. When we started, WAF was like the white whale in terms of collecting and finding anything in human size to wear.
It still is.
So that was my next question: is what we'll start with. My first question is, what are some good books? If anyone's interested in the WAF, what are some good titles to pick up and do some initial research on?
So one of my favorites was We All Wore Blue: Experiences in the WAF. And this is a one who started off enlisted and became an officer. So this was really good. And she also did some traveling in there. If anybody could get the Shire Classics, you have the Shire Library, which has the WAF. And inside, this one is a wealth of knowledge because it talks about the different trades. It talks about the different ranks and the pay you would get with the experience of what you have, your groups and things like that. So this goes into a lot of detail. There is one called The Debs of Bletchley Park and Other Stories, which goes into a lot of personal accounts. If you're interested in Bomber Command, then you have the WAF in Bomber Command. And again, that's a personal account. Sand in My Shoes is a personal account. Most of mine are going to be diaries. And of course, a lot of these are officers, but it's still a lot of good information. Pieces of Cake. So Piece of Cake was a very popular book about the Royal Air Force turned into a TV series. And so she titled her book Pieces of Cake, and she actually is enlisted, if I'm correct, The Diary of a Wartime WAF from 1940 to 1942. And a WAF in Wartime Britain, The True Story. So these are a lot of personal accounts that kind of gives you an idea. And I didn't even think about doing it. I'm probably gonna have to post it later in some comments, but there was actually a romance series, and I forget the lady who did it, but the ATS have never been glamorized. So if there was ever a story, it was going to be about the WAF or the Navy. And there was one actually did in the WAF, and they have a lot of nice details about what her life was like, which I wouldn't say was too far out there.
All right. Well, let's shift gears to the senior service. This has always been my personal favorite, both male and female. So you have the Wrens, the WRNS. What are their origins and how they evolved throughout the war?
Okay, so again, they were in World War I, but to my knowledge, they had the shortest stay in World War I. They were 1918 to 1919. And again, after the ATS was formed and people realized World War II is here, they reformed as the Women's Royal Naval Service. They've always kept that title to my knowledge. And their whole thing was to free men to go to sea. So send the boys out on the ships to fight. The Women's Royal Naval Service actually lasted from 1939 to the 1990s. They went full military in 1941, like everybody else, going from volunteers to complete auxiliary or reserve. But the difference is, unlike the others that kind of became various corps within, the Wrens stayed 100% the same. Nothing changed until the 1990s when they had just dropped the women's part and stayed Royal Naval Service. In 1944, they were at their peak of 75,000. They only made up 8.5% of the entire Royal Navy numbers during World War II. And this was the hardest branch for women to get into. It also had the most attractive uniform. So if you ever know anything about American reenacting, most people don't like the WWII uniform. And of course, we had no Air Force, so it was the same uniform. Everybody loves the Waves uniform. Well, in this case, the Royal Navy seems to have the uniform everybody loves because the women wanted to join the Women's Royal Naval Service, but they couldn't get in because it was the hardest. They had the fewest numbers.
Well, that was kind of leading into my next question, is the Royal Navy isn't known for being a bastion of forward thinking. Do they, so clearly they got more stringent enlistment requirements.
Yes.
What about in terms of how they're, so is it a numbers game because we don't have that many billets to fill? Is it a numbers game because we don't want them? Or is it we only have very specific limited roles for them? And
none of my research clarifies that, but their roles are limited. If you're freeing men to go off on a warship, there's not much left on land to do or take care of. You had your usual 3 C's. And then, of course, you're maintaining the barracks for the people who are here, but the majority of the males are out sailing ships. Women did work telegraph, radio, and signals. Signals was one of their big ones. They would use the signal flags. They would use various signal lamps. They would do a lot of shore to ship. There were boat crews, but those boat crews basically just monitored waterways or transported people from land to the ships. They did do intelligence. They did dispatch. They were some of the first dispatch riders and some of the most popular dispatch riders. Torpedo boat patrols, but yes, most of theirs was limited. And of course, like the ATS and WAF, they did have people at Bletchley Park.
well, that was you segued into my next question, which was, what sort of roles? So you've got kind of a little bit of everything. You've got from what I've looked at, you've got radio techs, you've got parachute packers for the Fleet Air Arm, you've got like you said, the 3 C's. Did they run their own provost like in the Army? They had female provosts.
I would like to say yes, because back then women monitored women, not men. But I have never really studied into that. What I have noticed is that if you ever look at the various services, the number of women to ratio of men always goes on the jobs. So the Army seems to have the most jobs of all the services, so they would have the most women, and then it just trickles on down. The Royal Navy was focused mostly on the sea, so if women can't go to sea, you don't need as many women. But I would always assume back then women did not, like men did not police women. They could, but they would always have to have the female there, just like the police auxiliaries and the civilians.
What about so they weren't deployed on a ship? Did they send any of them abroad?
Yes. There have been accounts of the women Navy services going to India. I'm trying to think. They did make it into the Pacific. I'm trying to remember specifics. I want to say there might have been like Cambodia or someplace out there. Like they really did go out there. And I know you're going to ask about the uniform next. Their uniform was a white drill. So, well, we'll get into that more detail too, because we didn't really talk about their uniform yet.
Yeah, you're jumping ahead of my questions.
Well, you're asking where they're serving. So yes, we have examples of them serving Beirut. That's the one. So yeah, I don't know why I was thinking Cambodia, but they did go out into the Pacific, and I don't think so much as in Africa as they did the Pacific, where the Navy.
Beirut's in Palestine. So
Yeah.
That's Mideast, and you've got them in India as well.
Yeah.
I think there were also I remember reading accounts that some of them were shipped to South Africa, and they may have sent a few over to Australia, though I think Australia had their own.
They had their own. So did the Canadians. But yeah, they were in most of the areas. Like I've never seen them like in Northern Africa. There might have been some in Egypt from time to time, but I don't think it was like a full on station.
Gibraltar was another one,
Yeah,
because that was a big naval base for the Royal Navy.
yeah.
Well, it was it was the choke point in the Ned. So, what's the basic Wren service dress uniform looking
All
like?
right, so they had a two-bore skirt, and it was made of a wool, thicker wool than I would say the others. In a World War II versus a modern, this is actually a more modern, like post-war uniform that I converted. A post-war uniform would come, like from this collar, would come all the way out and down. But World War II, you have more of that V. So all I did when I converted it was to cut this part in and restitch it to look like the World War II uniform. It is double-breasted. It's got the black buttons. This one, unlike the other women's jackets, it's hard to see on a hanger, but it actually does have a curve to it. So it fits the natural curves of the female body. And this one is geared towards signals. And actually, they would be given the nickname of bunt because the flags were called buntings. And so that would be their kind of a nickname, whereas Sparky would be the ones who worked in electric signals. And then they would have the same cap as a male. So this is the one thing they have in, and this one has been sitting on a shelf, and I have to dust it off.
It's similar,
And
it's
it
not
would-
the same. It's not the same
Yeah.
exact type.
They would have the tally that just says His Majesty's Service, or in modern times, Her Majesty's Service, but it is a cap tally. Whereas men would sometimes have the ship, or the ship would have been removed in wartime because they didn't want people to know. It's just the simple HMS tally.
The big thing with the big difference between the Wren's cap is the band is shorter and it's not rigid. The men's is rigid.
Yeah, and this one does not have it. Does this one? So these are both missing it, but there should also be a ribbon that's a chin strap, and it would be stitched inside the cap, which is leather inside, and then it would somehow be pinned or attached to the outside. So on rainy days, you'll sometimes see them wearing the chin strap to keep their hats on.
So I'm looking at these, and the Good Idea Fairy just showed up because black wool Melton or black wool gabardine
Mm-hmm.
is
Well, it's really technically supposed to be
it's
more
navy-
blue.
navy dark.
The post-war is a slightly different wool
Mhm.
than the World War II style, and it looks darker. The World War II style still maintains more of a blue appearance, but if you go by the 10-foot rule, because this is another uniform that is very hard to get wartime.
Well, that was where I was going with this, is that the materials are available
Mm-hmm.
and I can pattern your original. So maybe we'll see some Wren stuff
Okay.
in the pipeline, because this is basically a beret with a headband on.
Yeah, and a
Um,
leather
and a-
liner.
That's going to be the only thing I don't want to do is the leather
Yeah.
headband, because those are a pain in the butt.
And they are also have the
Oh, the oilskin lining.
yeah, because obviously you don't want to get your head wet working by water.
That's going to be tough to do.
But yeah, those are some of the things, like this is darker and actually a finer wool than you would get in World War II, because I have seen an original.
Yeah.
But again, they are so hard to come by. It is just a lot easier to get a post-war, which is very abundant. Fix that collar, and from a couple of feet, it's really difficult to notice.
Yeah, the originals, as I believe, were a Melton or a Serge.
Yeah.
That's a gabardine. But all right, well, something to think about. You know, the more skill set I develop, the more of a challenge I want to.
And then in the tropics, like I said, they had a white drill, and it was like a white button-down blouse, short sleeve. The caps were made of drill.
Wasn't there a floppy cap at some point that was
Yes,
similar to the
early
U.S.
war.
Navy?
It is early war, like 1939, 1940. But those are very hard to come by. I think I've only ever seen a picture of one original outside of a uniform book. That, yeah,
I've never seen one. I can truly say I've never seen one in captivity, so to speak.
yeah.
And of course, the officers were different. They had the tricorn.
Yeah, the tricorn, brass buttons, like petty officer and above had brass buttons.
Okay.
Most people, the officers' ones are easier to come by, ironically.
So we were supposed to have her lead off the series, but later on, she's going to be coming up on next Thursday. So I was gonna have Sarah Westrick on to talk about the, hold on, make it. I jumped the question, I apologize.
Yeah.
Were there any working garments? That was my next question. So you got
Yes.
service, you've got service dress now. Are the working garments specifically designed for women, or are they just come
No,
off
there's
and mid stuff?
specifically, there is a one-piece coverall again for women who are doing certain jobs, and they would have their rubber boots. But overall, they had the same wraparound pattern as the ATS and the WAF. Some of the big differences was the Wrens who were waitresses for the officers had a very specific uniform. And I have found one black and white picture of it. I have never seen this thing in person. I have never seen it, like you said, in captivity. I've never seen it in color. But it is like a lighter color with darker collars and cuffs. And it is specifically for those who are serving in the mess halls of the officers.
No battle dress style?
No. Not that I've ever come across.
No, I'm
The boat crews, though,
They had
the boat crews wore the same uniform as the men. Bell bottoms, boat neck, and they had the white,
Plums.
yeah,
All right,
and the
so
money belts. That's my favorite. I love doing boat crew, if I only had a boat.
like I said, later on this week we're gonna have later on this month we're gonna have Sarah on to talk about U.S. Navy, U.S. Women's Marine Corps Reserve. The Royal Marines have a far closer bond historically, administratively, and identity-wise than our Marine Corps does. Unlike, our Marine Corps sees itself as a separate service. Theirs sees themselves as a very elite within the Royal Navy, and not a separate entity. Did they have anything equivalent to our USMC Women's Reserve?
Yes.
And then how they use them?
So the Marines are harder to get in. Even in modern day, women are still allowed in the Marines. Up until like the 1990s, it was like, oh, we'll take women, but you've got to pass our tests. And most women just couldn't pass the tests. So it was definitely more of an elite force. Their uniform was the same as a women's Royal Naval Service, except those who worked for the Marines had what I like to refer to as the tombstone red patch for the cap badge, and then the Royal Marines cap badge. These women mostly worked in payroll. So they considered themselves like the ATS that worked in your ACAC crews. These girls consider themselves the elite of the elite and better than everybody else. They also might be the ones dishing out the rum rations to both the men and women of the Naval Service. My ability to find much information on them, even to this day, is slim to none.
I mean, I went to the Royal Marines Museum 8 years, God, it's almost 10 years ago. And there was not a whole lot of information on them, even there.
Even finding their pictures. But the big things were payroll and possibly rum ration. But the big one was payroll. And the amount of women, I don't even know the number of women who made it into the Royal Marines.
It's very, I think I found like an estimate once. It was in the hundreds, not even the thousands.
And then I do have some books like Dancing in the Waves, A Wartime Wren at Sea. Britannia's Daughters, the story of the Wrens. It's literally take you from World War I to modern times. We have Wrens in Camera, which was done during World War II. And I found like a picture of them with the Marines in here. And of course, here's another pictorial history of the Wrens from World War I to modern times. And again, I have not found a single picture of them with the Marines. Even when like their nickname was Marines, Marens. So the Marine Auxiliary Royal Naval Service, which is really Marns, but it's pronounced Marins. And it's very difficult for me to find any information. So if anybody has anything, please let me know sources because I'd love to find more. But it is really the most difficult one for me to research.
Gotta be honest, this is almost making me want to rename my Royal Navy kit like I've been talking about doing, but not that much. So that was my kind of my wrap up was going to be what resources were out there. So you gave a couple of book titles, post-war uniforms, converted to wartime. We were kind of collecting during the heyday when you could still, there was a lot of stuff out on the market and it was still.
So, and even if you think about it, if you ever were to look at my ATS collection, if somebody says, can you give me books to look for on the ATS? I have 20 to 30 books. I have 7 books on the WWII and 5 books on the RENs, 4 books, except for ones that might be all generic. Here's a quick blurb on all of the services. So even it's harder to find some of this information, and even online. I mean, today I just went on when I had planning today and lunch, and the information I was finding was very generic.
Yeah.
So it's more depending on trying to find people who are doing first person accounts, and that's hard to come by. The big thing I can say is, like, for me to even wrap up without further questions, is just because they were women didn't mean they were safe. There were a total of 1,486 casualties. So those were the ones who were killed in action, wounded, or in some way, other shape or form, a casualty of war. Of that, 624 were fatalities. About half that number were from the ATS because they were larger and in more areas of service. 102 of those were RENs who died in action. So doing a quick math, maybe about 200 or so WAF. And again, those numbers dwindle based on the number, like how large their service was and where they served. Some of these women did die on ships going to their overseas stations.
All right. So, I mean, it's not like we have a huge audience, so I'm going to open up the floor for a couple of questions, and then we can just call it a night.
What are some of the comments?
Let's see. Stephen Bellier loves the kit behind us. Ashley is talking about how the short sleeves and the tropic surprise her because you'd think you would want longer sleeves for the skin, for the sun protection.
Yeah. I was kind of surprised about that too, because all the other services would just roll their sleeves up, but with the Royal Navy, well, and again, they're boat crews, like the men would always have, even in the tropics, just their short sleeves.
Yep.
I mean, this is a short one, but it's also one of the most difficult I've found to research.
Yeah, we didn't even touch on the Women's Land Army.
No, well, that's like civilian services.
Oh, I know, but still.
So yes, even though we do focus a lot on the military services, domestic history, I could go on and on and on about. The women and even the men at home did a huge job. First and foremost was taking care of the children and putting food in people's mouths. But yes, I could go on forever about the women's services, especially the lumberjills. The lumberjills are my favorite. And I managed to get a cat badge at a time when everybody says you will never find an original. And I did in 10 minutes.
Meanwhile, I'm sitting here trying to.
Yeah, and that was also too, and that since then people have found other cat badges and have been reproducing them. But I had one of the first originals, and it didn't cost me an arm and a leg. And I found it in Australia, of all places.
Well, hold on, we got someone coming in. Oh, I'm gonna be able to read this thing.
Seems like there's a few comments.
Air orderly. Oh, so Ashley's another good one. Were air orderlies, were they in action or just transporting back behind the lines? I think those were all just basic flights back to the UK.
It was, to my knowledge, they were mostly flights in the UK. Again, we didn't really go into Europe until 1944. So the majority of their work would have been those who were just moving around to the UK and assisting the nurses, getting them to various hospitals and locations. I'm sure in 1944, some of those who got down would have been going back to, but I don't think it would have been too much combat.
Well, we have a land girls question.
Okay.
Angela wants to know if we were discussing the land girls or if they ever had a uniform. So we didn't touch on the land girls because we were going to keep this military, but why not? We got an audience, so let's
So here's
get
the
into
deal.
it.
The land girls did have a uniform. It was an official uniform. There were corduroy breeches, knee socks, Oxfords, an Airtex polo shirt. They did have a sweater, a leather belt, and a wide-brimmed hat that was leather. And optional was the land girls tie. You could wear a green tie. Seriously, they had to private purchase the land girls tie. But because they were doing farm work, seriously, a lot of the times they had coveralls, milking jackets, and they would wear a lot of their own personal civilian shirts just because hey, everybody is only issued so much. And when you're doing farm work, that stuff can get kind of dirty pretty fast, especially depending on what your job was. If you're really interested in the land girls, that would be probably a whole other discussion, because there was a lot they did, including the lumberjills, and their uniform was slightly different because they would have a green beret. So if you're interested in the land girls, let us know. We could definitely do another.
So that's,
Yes.
I'm already thinking that's going to be a video for April or May.
Okay. And even if we may not be able to get to the polo shirt, I know there are patterns out there for the women's corduroy breeches.
Yeah, the breeches, the issue with the breeches is finding that real wide wale corduroy
Yeah.
to make them out of. And of course, obviously the polos are difficult because good luck finding air techs right now.
No, but you can always use any civilian blouse.
True.
But I'm saying I've known a lot of people who have managed to find the corduroy to reproduce the breeches.
All right, you're on deck now. Ashley
Okay.
wants to know about hairstyles.
Okay, hairstyles. So for the military services, I'm
Yep, for
assuming.
military services.
Okay, so just like the ATS, it's off the collar. So you had a lot of liberty in regards to if you had a permanent or whatnot, you had to keep your hair off the collar. So you would see a lot of girls doing coronet braids around their heads. They would like do the traditional rolls that the women would do. You'll see, especially with the Wrens, I have noticed with the Royal Navy, theirs was more flyaway. I like was looking through this today, and some of them are pushing the collar. But I've noticed with the Royal Navy, they must have been more lax because all of these women seem to have permed hair. Here's one with a roll. So she must have really long hair, but they have a lot of permanence. But another reason I like about the Royal Navy is they liked cats. They believed in pets. Nobody else was allowed to have them. But yes, short, off the collar. Royal Navy's was really big on no jewelry unless it was a wedding band, no makeup, whereas like the ATS and the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, you could do a lot of natural colors, and you might be able to have like a studded earring and a sweetheart badge. Royal Navy, yeah, I really didn't believe in any of that stuff. The only thing you were allowed with the wedding band, no makeup.
And Angela wanted to chime in real quick. What were the? Can you tell everyone, give everyone a brief run or a brief definition of what the lumberjills were and what they did?
Okay, so the lumberjills were part of the Women's Land Army, but their whole thing was trees. They were monitoring forests. Pole finders would go around and use very old-fashioned tools to calculate the width of a tree trunk, the circumference, and that would determine if it was going to be a signals pole, if it would go to a mine to hold up a ceiling, if it would be part of a roadblock. So they were called pole finders. And then they would paint each tree according to the color of what it was going to be used. They would also go looking for very specific types of wood for various jobs of burning certain heats to create certain ammunition or metals and stuff like that. Because there was like one very specific, and I can't think of its term off the top of my head, but they would go around looking for very specifics, and then other girls would come behind them and actually cut them down. And they would basically monitor, replant forests, just try to keep the lumber moving.
All right. Well, I want to close it up. So, all right. So Ashley said when she was in the service, they told them not to wear metal hairpins for safety reasons. Do you know if that was the case in the British Armed Forces?
Whatever the Kirby grip / bobby pin was made of, that's what they could use. Because I think that's all they had. I've never seen anything else.
Okay.
I mean, in England, they're called Kirby grips, and those are actually advertised with a lot of women. Now, you wouldn't wear them in factories. You would have your hairnet, but hairnets were not part of the military uniform. What is Angela saying?
I was just saying how cool the lumberjill information was.
The lumberjills were considered the elite of the land army because that was another one hard to get in. I took up the challenge when everybody said you would never find the cat badge.
I know my favorites. I have to say, of all of my favorite women's services, I don't know why, but the Marins are my favorite.
Mm-hmm. If we do the land girl ones, we'll have to post some of the pictures of my uniforms.
Yeah, we'll have to figure out. Well. So I was going to bring up my closing thoughts was we're going to be up in our game here with the live feeds going forward in April. I've been trying to figure. So everyone seems to like what we're doing. The issue I'm having is accessibility. And I may do a live feed on something and have a really good lot of information, really good guest, and then it gets buried or it disappears. And so I have taken the time to invest into a more in-depth streaming service. We've got the YouTube channel. So I don't know how many more live feeds we're going to be doing, but what we will be doing is probably start doing monthly or every couple of weeks, put a video out on a certain topic. I'm still kind of kicking that idea around. I like the idea of doing videos because I can pre-record them when it's convenient for me. Because honestly, sometimes you get swamped with work, and that day off doing a live feed really bites you into your productivity. But we'll still do some kind of live interactive stuff because I still do believe in that. But I have a feeling we will start. We're going to definitely simulcast them both on the YouTube channel and the Facebook page.
See, my question is this. So if you guys are out there and you want to comment, the Leningrad Tailor primary thing is to help create clothing and uniforms. What do you think about us doing a brief videos on brief histories and then showcasing the uniforms he can create for that point in history? So if we are talking Leningrad and early Soviet, and then we give you a brief history of what takes place in Leningrad, and then showcasing the uniform he is capable of making. Camp Shelby line is about to come out. So I know we've done things on the WWII in the past, but we could do another quick WWII video and then say, hey, by the way, this is the uniform.
That's a good idea.
And just little things like that. Maybe some things on the Soviet Air Force and show you the Air Force uniforms he's able to make. So tying the uniforms into a point of history so that you can see both, and we are now showcasing what we are capable of making.
Cool. But anyway, so if you haven't already, this is my last plea, please go over to the YouTube channel, hit like, hit subscribe.
Ironically, it's not so much because we're trying to find viewers and money. We're just trying to figure out where is the best way for people to find us.
Right. This is my, I'm not running, I'm a small business. This is my form of advertising, get my name out there. So, and plus it's good information. I mean, it's, I want this to be kind of a multifaceted endeavor. So, all right, everyone. Well, just the last thing, next Tuesday, I'm going to have Ethan Toy on to talk about women in the Red Army and Soviet wartime uniforms. So I will probably still be slightly feeling the pain from the weekend up at Newville, but I encourage you all to tune in. And until next time, have a great one.
Good night.